Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 23 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for all of Series 3, we've been going back to Tolkien's youth and off and on the TCBS. Now, often I've been leaning on the incredible research and powerful storytelling of John Garth from his must-read Tolkien and the Great War. I want to remind you, please check out his website. It's johngarth.co.uk. You can get Tolkien and the Great War, Tolkien at Exeter College, or the gorgeous The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, last time we followed Carpenter and Garth as we learned about Tolkien's windy and wet fortnight in camp with King Edward's horse and his intoxicating discovery of the Finnish language. Today, we'll pick up with his Christmas break in 1912 and his intended reunification with Edith Bratt. Now, we'll spend most of our time in Carpenter's biography today, though I plan on returning to Tolkien and the Great War next week to wrap up Series 3's Tolkien Tuesdays. Carpenter tells us that Tolkien spent his winter break in 1912 with his Incledon relatives. Mary and Marjorie Incledon were his cousins. Their mother was Mabel Tolkien's older sister. A quick digression here. I've talked about them before on Tolkien Tuesdays without actually mentioning them by name, back when I told you about Tolkien and invented languages. You see, it was the Incledon sisters that invented the Animatic language and taught some of it to Tolkien, according to both Carpenter as well as Phemian Higgins in A Secret Vice. Now, according to Carpenter, Tolkien and Mary Incledon worked together to invent a new and more sophisticated language, what would be called Nevbosh, or the New Nonsense. But Tolkien himself would downplay his involvement. In The Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien suggested that his role with the construction of Nevbosh was more limited, a contribution to the vocabulary and an influence on the spelling. Anyway, back to Christmas 1912. Carpenter tells us that, as usual in that family, the season was enlivened with theatricals. I just want to know why our world doesn't seem to do this anymore. Every Christmas, college kids are writing and staging plays during their breaks. That's not a thing. More's the pity. Well, in 1912, Tolkien wrote the play that the family would perform. Carpenter writes, it was called The Bloodhound, the Chef, and the Suffragette. Later in life, Tolkien professed to despise drama, but on this occasion he was not only the author, but the leading actor, playing Professor Joseph Quilter, M.A., B.A., ABC, alias Worldwide Detective Sexton Q. Blake Holmes, the Bloodhound, who is searching for a lost heiress named Gwendolen Goodchild. She, meanwhile, has fallen in love with a penniless student whom she meets while they are living in the same lodging house, and she has to remain undiscovered by her father until her 21st birthday in 2 days' time, after which she will be free to marry. That's just a bit on the nose, Tollers. But who can blame him? I mean, he'd spent the last almost 3 years waiting to reunite with his beloved Edith Bratt, who Carpenter says he was quite certain had waited for him. As the clock struck midnight and marked the beginning of 3 January 1913, his coming of age, he sat up in bed and wrote a letter to her, renewing his declaration of love and asking her, how long will it be before we can be joined together before God and the world? Now, let's move back to Garth's Tolkien and the Great War for just a quick bit. Now, he points out that this year, 1913, is when Tolkien's life reached its major personal and academic turning point. After all, not only had he been forced to set aside his relationship with Edith, Garth says it was becoming increasingly clear that in pursuing classics at Oxford, he was heading up a blind alley. And it turns out that, at least at first, his attempt at reunification with Edith was also heading that direction. Garth says that 3 years apart had withered her hopes, and she was engaged to someone else. Well, that had to come as a shock to young Ronald. As Carpenter puts it, she had been his ideal in the last 3 years, his inspiration and his hope for the future. He had nurtured and cultivated his love for her so that it grew in secret, even though it had to be fed solely on his memories of their adolescent romance and a few photographs of her as a child. Nothing for it, then, but to go to where she was living, in Cheltenham, and persuade her to break it off with her fiancé, a young man named George Field, whose claim to fame is now losing his fiancée to the most beloved fantasy author of all time. Carpenter writes, in truth, he knew that she would say yes. She had hinted as much in her letter, explaining that she had only become engaged to George because he had been kind to her, and she felt on the shelf, and there was no other young man that she knew, and she had given up believing that Ronald would want to see her again after the 3 years had passed. I began to doubt you, Ronald, she told him in her letter, and to think you would cease to care for me. But now that he had written to renew his vow of love, she indicated that everything had changed. Carpenter continues, "So on Wednesday, 8 January 1913, he traveled by train to Cheltenham and was met on the platform by Edith. They walked out into the country and sat under a railway viaduct where they talked. By the end of the day, Edith had declared that she would give up George Field and marry Ronald Tolkien. She wrote to George and sent him back his ring, and he, poor young man, was dreadfully upset at first, and his family was insulted and angry. But eventually the matter ceased to be alluded to, and they all became friends once more." You'll forgive me if I doubt that last conclusion of Carpenter's. Now, when Tolkien returned to the next term at Oxford, he wrote to Father Francis, his former guardian, and the man who had forbidden Tolkien from contacting Edith for nearly 3 years. He was more than a little reticent to tell him that he and Edith were going to get married, but, as Carpenter puts it, when Father Francis's reply came, it was calm and resigned, if far from enthusiastic. This was crucial, because even though he wasn't Tolkien's guardian anymore, Father Francis did still supply financial support that Tolkien needed badly. A good thing, as Tolkien still had work to do before graduating, and we're going to look at some of that work next week as we conclude Series 3, Tolkien Tuesdays. But folks, that does wrap it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Now please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe on your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.